The question came out of nowhere, shattering the graveyard silence. It was a little girl's voice, small and thin, like wind whistling through a crack in a door, and the words she spoke broke something deep inside Thomas Garrett's chest. "Do you also cry from hunger?" He'd been standing there for 3 hours, a statue of grief staring at a block of cold stone. The stone had a name carved into it. Michael Garrett, beloved son, 7 years of light, his son, his light, gone. The sun was crawling across the sky and Thomas hadn't moved a muscle. He was a man hollowed out, a walking shell filled with nothing but whiskey and regret. For 3 months, this grave had been his entire world. Then, she appeared. Like a ghost made of rags and dust, she stood at the edge of his property. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and a face so thin it looked like a skull with skin stretched over it. Her dress was a patchwork of holes, and her feet were bare, cracked and bleeding. But it was her eyes that froze him. They were empty. Not the innocent emptiness of childhood, but the hard, cold emptiness of an old soul that had seen too much. It was the same void he saw in his own reflection every single morning. The look of someone who had lost everything and was somehow, cruelly, still breathing. She took a shaky step forward. "Mister," she said again, her voice cracking, "do you also cry from hunger?" Thomas felt his throat tighten into a knot of solid rock. He hadn't spoken a real word to anyone in weeks. What could he say? That his hunger wasn't for food, that he was starving for the sound of his son's laughter, for the weight of his small hand, for a past he could never get back? He thought she was speaking in metaphors, a tiny poet of despair. He was wrong. So wrong. She swayed on her feet, a sapling in a hurricane, and her hand went to her stomach. Her stomach wasn't just flat. It was concave, a hollowed-out bowl beneath the ripped fabric of her dress. Her wrists were no thicker than twigs. This wasn't poetry. This was starvation. His own grief felt like a pathetic luxury in that moment. He was a man letting his world crumble around him. She was a child fighting to see the next sunrise. "When did you last eat?" His voice was a rusty hinge, creaking from disuse. "Yesterday," she said, as if stating a simple fact. "Found some berries. Most of them were bad, though." He looked closer, really looked. The chill of late October was setting in, painting the landscape in shades of brown and gray. She had no coat, no shoes, no one. A piece of human driftwood washed up at the foot of his son's grave. She was just like Michael in those last, terrible days, helpless, fading, while he, the father, could do nothing but watch. An unfamiliar feeling stirred in his gut, something hot and sharp pushing through the cold fog of his sorrow. It was rage, pure, blinding rage at a world that let children starve and let fevers steal 7-year-old boys. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice a little softer this time. She flinched back the moment he moved. A wild thing, cornered and terrified. He stopped, holding his hands up slightly to show they were empty. "Rose," she whispered, the name barely audible. "Rose Murphy. My paw. He went to the mines. Said he'd be back before the snow." She looked at the gray, pregnant clouds overhead. "The snow's coming soon." Thomas didn't need to hear the rest. Another broken promise. Another man who walked away, leaving a child to navigate the wreckage. "I'm Thomas Garrett," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "This is my ranch." He paused, forcing himself to meet her empty eyes. "Are you hungry right now, Rose Murphy?" She nodded, a quick, jerky motion. Then, as if remembering some harsh lesson, she straightened her tiny spine. "I can work, mister. I don't want no charity. I can sweep. I can fetch water. I'm strong. I just need a little food to keep going until my paw gets back." The hope in her voice was the most devastating thing he had ever heard. She still believed, after all this, after the hunger and the cold and the loneliness, She still believed her father was coming back for her. Michael had been full of that same hope. Tomorrow I'll feel better, Pa. Tomorrow we can go fishing. Tomorrow never came. I don't need any work done, Thomas lied. The lie tasted like ash, but it was a necessary one. The ranch was a disaster. Fences were down, the barn door hung on one hinge, and weeds choked what was once a proud garden. He was a breath away from losing everything, but he wouldn't make this child work for a meal. He just couldn't. Thing is, he continued, another lie forming easily, I made too much stew yesterday. A whole pot. It'll just go bad if I don't get some help eating it. He hadn't cooked in months. He'd been living on stale bread and the bitter fire of whiskey. But some lies are a form of prayer, a prayer for a world that should be, instead of the one that is. Her eyes, those terribly old eyes, widened with a flash of childish wonder. Really? You'd share it with me? The question twisted the knife of his own failure. When was the last time someone had shown this child a simple kindness? When was the last time she'd been given something without having to beg or barter or pay a price she couldn't afford? Come on, he grunted, turning toward the ramshackle house before she could see the sudden moisture in his eyes. Let's get you fed. She followed him, but kept her distance, a shadow flitting at his heels. Every step she took was cautious, ready to bolt. The world had taught her that a helping hand was often followed by a fist. He couldn't blame her. The kitchen was a mausoleum of his old life. Dust covered every surface like a fine gray snow. The cupboards were mostly bare. But he had something. A bag of beans, some salt pork, a few wrinkled potatoes from his neglected garden. It was enough. As he moved around the kitchen, starting a fire in the old wood stove, he could feel her watching him. She stood pressed against the far wall, making herself as small as possible, a mouse hoping the hawk won't notice it's there. You can sit down, he said, gesturing to a chair at the table. She shook her head instantly. I'm fine right here, mister. I don't want to get your things dirty. The politeness of the damned. She had learned to apologize for her own existence. Michael had never known a single day of that kind of fear. He had owned this house, filled it with his noise and his mess and his light. Rose was trying to be invisible. Thomas's hands trembled as he stirred the pot. The savory smell of the stew began to fill the room, a ghost of a happier time. When it was ready, he ladled out 2 huge portions, steam rising in thick, welcoming clouds. He set one bowl in front of the empty chair, and one for himself. Go on, he said gently. It's for you. She approached the table like it was a wild animal that might bite. She picked up the spoon with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. She took one small, hesitant bite, her eyes closed. Then she took another, and another. Soon she was eating with a desperate, frantic energy. It wasn't just hunger, it was a deep, primal fear that the food might be taken away. That this moment of warmth and plenty was a dream she might wake from at any second. Thomas barely touched his own bowl. He just watched her. He had forgotten what this felt like. The simple, profound act of feeding someone who was hungry, of being useful, of being something other than a mourner. This is the best stew I ever had, she mumbled between mouthfuls, her voice thick with food and emotion. Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Thank you. He just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. When her bowl was so clean it looked like it had been washed, he finally found his voice again. He had to ask. He dreaded the answer, but he had to know. Where have you been sleeping, Rose? Her whole body tensed, the wild animal returning. Places, she said vaguely. The old Miller barn sometimes, under the bridge when it rains. I move around a lot. The image hit him like a physical blow. This tiny girl, huddled under a cold, damp bridge, while he rattled around a 4-bedroom house, drowning himself in self-pity. The shame was so intense it made him feel sick. He looked out the window. The sky had turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind was starting to howl. "There's a storm coming tonight," he said, his voice flat. "A big one. You can't be outside in that." Her face went pale. He could see the terror she'd been holding back. The false bravery crumbled, revealing the scared little girl underneath. "I'll be okay," she lied, her voice trembling. "I always manage." But her eyes were pleading for an offer she was too proud or too afraid to ask for. Asking meant admitting need, and need was weakness. "There's a spare room," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "Upstairs, just sitting empty." He looked away from her at the fireplace. "Seems a waste to heat the whole house for just me." Her breath hitched. He saw tears well up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of a dirty hand. You'd let me stay? Truly?" Her voice was a whisper of disbelief. "I won't be any trouble, I swear. I'll be gone before you wake up." And then he said something that surprised even himself. Something that felt like the first true thing he'd said in 3 months. "No rush." A few hours ago, all he wanted was to be left alone with his ghosts. But looking at this fragile, fierce, broken little girl, he realized something profound. Solitude wasn't healing him. It was killing him. "We'll see what the weather looks like in the morning," he added. She nodded, a wave of relief washing over her face that was so pure it almost brought him to his knees. And in that moment, the knot of grief in his chest loosened its grip, just a little. He felt a flicker of something he thought was long dead. Purpose. Later that night, the storm hit with full force. Rain lashed against the windows and wind screamed like a banshee. But inside the house, for the first time in months, there was a strange kind of peace. Thomas had shown her to the spare room. He hadn't thought about which one. He'd just led her up the stairs and opened the second door on the right. And now, sitting by the fire, he realized his mistake. It was Michael's room. He'd put her in his dead son's bed. He hadn't been inside that room since the funeral. He couldn't bear it. The smell of the medicine, the little wooden soldiers on the nightstand, the indentation on the pillow where his son's head had last rested. It was a holy place, a place of unbearable pain, and he had just given it to a stranger. He should have been horrified. He should have been angry at himself. But as he sat there, listening to the soft sounds of her settling in upstairs, a different feeling washed over him. It felt right. The room had been a tomb. Now it was a sanctuary. It had been empty for too long, waiting for someone who needed its warmth, its safety. He poured his nightly glass of whiskey, the amber liquid glinting in the firelight. He raised it to his lips, the familiar ritual a comfort. But tonight, he didn't want it. He didn't need the numbness it offered. He set the glass down, untouched. He just sat there, sober, listening to the storm outside and the quiet sounds of life inside his house. The house was breathing again. It had a purpose again. And it was all because of a little girl with haunted eyes who had asked him a question that had changed everything. "Do you also cry from hunger?" Yes, he thought. Yes, he did. But he was beginning to understand that some hungers can only be filled by feeding someone else, and some empty rooms can only be filled by offering shelter from the storm. He drifted off to sleep in his chair, a strange peace settling over him. But he had no idea that the real storm was yet to come. He woke with a start to a house that was utterly, terrifyingly silent. The fire was dead, leaving a cold chill in the air. The morning light was gray and weak, but it was the silence that scared him. The house felt empty again, hollowed out, just as it had been for the last 3 months. "Rose?" he called out, his voice rough with sleep. No answer. A cold dread snaked its way up his spine. He pushed himself out of the chair and bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding against his ribs. He threw open the door to Michael's room. The bed was made. Neatly. Too neatly. As if no one had ever slept in it. The room was empty. She was gone. He raced back down to the kitchen, his mind refusing to accept it. Maybe she was getting a drink of water. Maybe she was exploring the barn. Any explanation was better than the one screaming in his head. On the kitchen table, he saw it. A scrap of paper, torn from an old feed sack. On it, in the careful, struggling letters of a child learning to write, was a note. Thank you for the food and the bed. I do not want to be a burden. I will remember your kindness always. Rose. He crushed the note in his fist, a raw curse tearing from his throat. Burden? She thought she was a burden? After she had breathed life back into this dead house? The stubborn pride of that little girl was going to get her killed. He didn't waste a second. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his coat, and stormed out into the damp, cold morning. The storm had passed, leaving the world a soggy, miserable mess. The ground was slick with mud, and the air was cold enough to see his breath. Perfect weather for a little girl with no coat and no shoes to catch her death. He had to find her. He checked the barn first, the place she'd mentioned sleeping. He tore through the dusty, debris-filled space, calling her name until his throat was raw. Nothing. He ran to the creek, his boots sinking in the mud, his eyes scanning the banks, praying he wouldn't find her small body washed up against the rocks. Nothing. He saddled his horse, his movements frantic and clumsy. He couldn't lose another child. He just couldn't. He wouldn't survive it. He rode for hours, a man possessed. He checked every abandoned shack, every hunting blind, every trail within 10 miles of his ranch. The sun was high in the sky, a pale, watery disk, when he finally gave up on the back roads and headed toward the main road to town. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort. And that's when he saw her. A tiny figure, trudging along the muddy shoulder of the road. She was carrying something in her arms, a clumsy bundle of something. He spurred his horse, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. "Rose!" he yelled. She spun around, her eyes wide with the panicked look of someone caught in a crime. She clutched her bundle to her chest, trying to hide it. He slid from his saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a splash. "Rose Murphy," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "Where in God's name do you think you're going?" She flinched but held her ground. Her chin came up, a gesture of pure, uncut defiance. "To town, Mr. Garrett." He finally saw what she was holding. It was wildflowers, scraggly, half-wilted weeds she must have picked from the roadside ditches. She had arranged them into sad little bouquets. "I'm going to sell these," she declared, her voice trembling but firm, "for a penny apiece, to earn money for my own bread." And that's what finally broke him. Not the grave, not the empty house, not the silence. It was this half-starved child, so full of broken pride, trying to sell weeds to strangers because she refused to be a burden, because the world had taught her that survival had to be earned, every single miserable day. "Rose," he said, his voice cracking. He crouched down in the mud, so he was at her level. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to sell flowers on the side of the road." "I'm not a beggar," she shot back, her eyes flashing. "My pa taught me. He said you work for what you get. He said charity makes you weak." He wanted to find that man, Jeremiah Murphy, and beat some sense into him. But that wouldn't help the proud, terrified little girl standing in front of him. "Your pa sounds like a proud man," Thomas said carefully. "But tell me something, Rose. Does weakness mean accepting a warm bed during a storm? Does it mean eating a hot meal when you're starving?" She looked down, her defiance wavering. People get mad. If you take things, they look at you like you're dirt." So that was it. She'd been turned away, shouted at, made to feel worthless for the simple crime of being hungry and alone. "Let me ask you a different question," he said, his voice soft. Last night, when you were in my house, did it feel like a home? She looked up, confused. Yes. It did to me too, he said, for the first time in a very long time. You brought something back to that house, Rose. Something I thought was gone forever. You think that's worth nothing? You think you didn't give me something in return? She just stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. But I didn't do anything. I just ate your stew. He almost smiled. Exactly. You were just there. And that was enough. Sometimes, Rose, helping someone isn't about charity. Sometimes the person doing the helping needs it more than the person being helped. He stood up and held out his hand. It was scarred and calloused from a lifetime of ranch work, but it was steady. I want you to come home, Rose Murphy. Not to work, not to pay your way, just to be there. The house is too quiet without you. She looked at his outstretched hand, then at her pathetic bouquets of weeds, then back at his hand. For a long moment, she didn't move. He thought she was going to refuse, that her pride was a wall too high for him to climb. Then, slowly, she reached out her small, cold hand and placed it in his. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Okay, she whispered, a tear finally tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. Okay, I'll come home. She looked down at the flowers still clutched in her other arm. But I'm keeping these. Maybe we can put them in a jar. As he lifted her onto the horse in front of him, he felt a profound sense of rightness. This was right. Bringing this girl home was the first right thing he'd done in a very, very long time. But as they rode back towards the ranch, a cold thought slithered into his mind. Her father. The man who had taught her this dangerous, stubborn pride. The man who had promised to come back. What would happen when he finally did? The ride back was different. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It was comfortable. Rose, perched in front of him on the saddle, held her wildflowers like a royal scepter. She started asking questions, her natural childhood curiosity bubbling to the surface now that her belly was full and her future seemed, for the moment, secure. Why do those birds fly in a V shape? Can a horse really sleep standing up? Do you think clouds have feelings? They were Michael's questions. The same innocent, profound questions his own son used to ask, questions that made him see the world anew. For months, Thomas had seen the world in shades of gray. Now, through Rose's eyes, he was starting to see color again. When they got back to the house, he found a few old mason jars, and they arranged her scraggly bouquets around the kitchen. The splash of yellow and purple from the wildflowers instantly transformed the gloomy room. It looks like the house is smiling now, Rose said, and he couldn't disagree. That afternoon, a strange impulse took hold of Thomas. He walked out to the barn, picked up a hammer, and started fixing the broken gate. It was a task he'd been putting off for months. As he worked, Rose trailed behind him, a small, chattering shadow, handing him nails and asking a million more questions. The work didn't feel like a chore. It felt like rebuilding, like he wasn't just fixing a fence, but fixing his life. Mr. Garrett? Rose said, her tone suddenly serious. They were mending a section of fence by the pasture. Can I ask you something personal? He stopped hammering. Anything, Rose. She chewed on her lower lip, gathering her courage. That grave, in the yard, it says son, but there's no grave for a wife, and there's no wife in the house. What happened to her? The hammer suddenly felt heavy in his hand. He had known this question was coming. He set it down and sat on a pile of lumber, the autumn sun feeling thin and weak on his shoulders. My wife, Sarah. She died when Michael was born, he said, the words tasting like rust. I raised him by myself, for 7 years. Then the fever came last spring. I couldn't save him either. I lost them both. Rose's face fell, her expression full of a sorrow that was far too deep for an 8-year-old. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just came and sat beside him on the lumber pile, her small shoulder pressing against his arm. "My ma died too," she said quietly. "When I was 5. Pa said it was her lungs, but I think it was sadness. She missed her home back east. After she was gone, Pa got quiet, like a part of him was buried with her. Maybe that's why he left for the mines. Maybe looking at me just hurt too much." The guilt in her voice was a perfect echo of his own. The terrible, irrational belief that you are somehow the cause of the pain around you. "No," Thomas said, his voice firm, surprising them both. "Her dying wasn't your fault, Rose. Any more than Michael's was mine. Sometimes things just break, and it's nobody's fault." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think the people we lost, would they want us to be sad forever?" He had never considered it. He had treated his grief like a sacred duty, a monument to his love for Michael. But would his son, a boy who found joy in sunshine and butterflies, want his father to live in perpetual darkness? "I think," Thomas said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke, "I think they'd want us to remember them with love, not pain. I think they'd want us to honor them by living. Really living." That evening, a fragile new routine began to form. After supper, as they sat in the warm glow of the kitchen, Rose's eyes fell upon a small object on the mantelpiece. It was a wooden horse, crudely carved but made with obvious love. "Did you make this?" she asked, her voice hushed. Thomas nodded, a familiar ache in his chest. "For Michael's 6th birthday. He named it Thunder." Rose picked it up, tracing the lines of the carved mane with her finger. "It's beautiful. It feels alive." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a sudden, fierce desire. "Could you teach me? How to do that? How to make something beautiful out of just a piece of wood?" The request stunned him. His hands, which for months had done nothing but lift a whiskey bottle or grip the handle of a shovel, were being asked to create something again, to teach, to share. "It takes patience," he warned. "You'll cut yourself. You'll make a lot of mistakes." "I don't mind mistakes," she said, her gaze steady. "Pa used to say I was good at fixing things that were broken." The irony was so thick he could taste it. Two broken people, trying to fix each other. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet domesticity. Thomas taught Rose how to hold a carving knife, how to read the grain of the wood. Her small hands, once cracked and bleeding, proved to be surprisingly nimble and creative. She carved a small, lopsided bird, then a squirrel with a comically large tail, and with every curl of wood that fell to the floor, a piece of the gloom in the house seemed to fall away with it. Thomas started fixing more things around the ranch. He repaired the barn roof, tilled the dead garden, and even bought a few chickens. He was starting to feel like himself again, or perhaps a new version of himself. Someone stronger, someone with a reason to get up in the morning. He started to let himself imagine a future with Rose. Maybe he could adopt her, make it official, give her his name. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was so caught up in this fragile new hope that he didn't see the shadow approaching on the horizon. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the postman. It was a single, official-looking envelope, addressed to him. The return address was from the Territorial Mining Office in Goldfield. His blood ran cold. Mining offices only wrote for 2 reasons, and neither of them was good. "What is it?" Rose asked, looking up from the wooden flower she was trying to carve. "Just mail," he said, forcing a smile. He stepped out onto the porch, his hands trembling as he tore open the envelope. The letter was short, the words typed with brutal efficiency. "We regret to inform you. Jeremiah Murphy, killed in a mine collapse. October 15th. October 15th. That was over a month ago. While Rose was sleeping under bridges, while she was selling flowers on the side of the road, while she was sitting in his kitchen carving a wooden bird and dreaming of her father's return. He was already dead, buried in some anonymous cemetery hundreds of miles away. The letter wasn't done with him, though. The final sentence was a punch to the gut. Mr. Murphy listed no next of kin. However, a letter was found among his personal effects, addressed to a Mr. Silas Blackwood of Willow Creek, regarding the final payment for the sale of his daughter Rose. Thomas read the sentence again, and again. Sale. Of his daughter. Rose. The world tilted on its axis. Jeremiah Murphy hadn't abandoned his daughter to find work. He hadn't left with a promise to return. He had sold her. He had sold his daughter to a man named Silas Blackwood, and now, Thomas realized with a surge of pure, cold terror, that man was probably looking for his property. He crumpled the letter in his fist, his mind racing. This changed everything. This wasn't about a father who wasn't coming home. This was about a monster who had discarded his child like a piece of trash. And worse, it meant Rose wasn't a lost orphan. In the eyes of the law, she might be someone else's property. He walked back into the kitchen, his face a mask of stone. Rose looked up at him, her smile fading as she saw his expression. "Mr. Garrett, is everything okay?" He knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his. He had to tell her. He had to tell her part of the truth, at least. But how could he tell her the whole monstrous story? How could he tell this brave, proud little girl that her own father had sold her for pocket money? "Rose," he began, his voice thick with a pain that was suddenly fresh and new. "That letter, it was about your pa." Her eyes lit up with that same devastating hope he'd seen before. "Is he coming home?" He had to kill that hope. He had to tear it out by the roots before it destroyed her completely. "Rose," he said, his voice breaking, "there was an accident at the mine, a long time ago. He's not coming home." He watched her face as the words sank in. He braced himself for tears, for screams, for the shattering of a little girl's world. He got something far, far worse. She didn't cry. Her expression went utterly blank. Her eyes, which had just started to regain their light, turned back into those two empty voids he'd seen at the graveyard. She pulled her hands from his and took a step back. "Did he sell me?" she asked, her voice a dead, flat monotone. The air left Thomas's lungs in a rush. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. How could she know? How could she possibly know to ask that specific, horrifying question? "Rose, what are you talking about?" he stammered, trying to buy time, trying to find a lie that would soften this unbearable truth. "He did it before," she said, her voice still empty of all emotion. "After Ma died, he sold me to a farmer over in the next county. Said he needed the money for a fresh start. I ran away, lived in the woods for a month before he found me again. He promised he wouldn't do it again." The story was so horrific, so beyond the realm of what he thought possible, that for a moment he couldn't speak. This child hadn't just been abandoned. She had been betrayed in the most fundamental way a parent can betray a child. She had been treated as an object, a commodity, and she had been living with this terror her entire life. Her desperate hope that he was coming back wasn't just a child's wish. It was a prayer that he had finally decided to be a father, not a monster. The rage that filled Thomas was so immense, so powerful, it felt like it could burn the world down. He wasn't just grieving anymore. He was at war. "Yes," he said, his voice a low growl. "He did. The letter says he sold you to a man named Silas Blackwood." She just nodded, as if her worst fears had simply been confirmed. The fight seemed to go out of her. Her small shoulders slumped. "So, he'll be coming for me soon?" "No," Thomas said, his voice ringing with a conviction that startled them both. He stood up, towering over her, a sudden and absolute protector. No one is coming for you. No one is ever taking you anywhere you don't want to go. Do you understand me, Rose? She looked up at him, a flicker of something, not hope, but maybe confusion, in her dead eyes. But he bought me. I'm his property. You are not property, Thomas roared, his voice echoing through the small kitchen. You are a person. You are Rose Murphy, and this is your home now. He pointed a trembling finger at the floorboards. This is your home, and I am your family, and Silas Blackwood can go to hell. It was a declaration of war against a man he'd never met, against a legal system that might see things differently, against the entire cruel, broken world. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have any legal right to her. All he had was a conviction, forged in grief and rage, that this little girl was not for sale. That night, for the first time, Rose had a nightmare. Thomas woke to the sound of her screaming, a terrified animal sound that ripped through the quiet house. He found her sitting bolt upright in Michael's bed, her eyes wide with terror, her hands clenched in the blankets. "He's coming!" she cried, not fully awake. "He's in the trees! I can see his yellow eyes!" He sat on the edge of her bed, his heart aching. "It's just a dream, Rose. You're safe. No one is coming." It took him an hour to calm her down, to convince her she was safe. As he sat there, in the dark, in his dead son's room, watching this traumatized little girl finally drift back into a troubled sleep, he knew he couldn't just wait for Silas Blackwood to show up. He had to fight. He had to make her legally his, before this Blackwood character could stake his claim. The next morning, he rode into the town of Willow Creek, his jaw set with grim determination. He left Rose at the ranch with a shotgun, instructions to barricade the door, and a promise that he would be back before sundown. The territorial courthouse was a squat, ugly building that seemed to suck the hope out of the air. The clerk inside was a man named Peterson, a thin, weaselly man with watery eyes and a sour expression. Thomas explained the situation, leaving out the part about her being sold, simply stating that she was an orphan, and he wished to begin adoption proceedings. Peterson looked at him over the top of his spectacles, his lip curling in a slight sneer. "Garrett, isn't it? The fella whose ranch is falling to pieces? The one who spends more time at the saloon than in his own fields?" The town was small. Thomas's grief-fueled neglect had not gone unnoticed. "I'm fixing the ranch," Thomas said through gritted teeth. "And I haven't had a drink in weeks." "An orphan, you say? What's her name?" Peterson asked, dipping his pen in an inkwell. "Rose Murphy." Peterson's pen stopped dead. He slowly looked up, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine interest appeared in his watery eyes. It was not a friendly interest. "Murphy," he repeated slowly. "Daughter of Jeremiah Murphy?" A cold dread washed over Thomas. "Yes, how did you know?" Peterson gave a thin, unpleasant smile. "Because a man was in here not 2 days ago, filing a property claim, a Mr. Silas Blackwood. It seems he purchased the indenture of a young girl named Rose Murphy from her father. All legal and binding. Paid $20 for her." The clerk leaned back in his chair, the smile widening. "So, you see, Mr. Garrett, you're not trying to adopt an orphan. You're trying to steal another man's property, and in this territory, that's a hanging offense." The world swam before Thomas's eyes. Blackwood wasn't some distant threat. He was here, he was in town, he had already made his move. That's slavery," Thomas choked out. "You can't buy and sell a child." Peterson shrugged, clearly enjoying Thomas's distress. "The law calls it indenture, a contract for labor, perfectly legal when the parent consents, and Jeremiah Murphy's signature is right here on this bill of sale." He tapped a document on his desk. "Mr. Blackwood has the law on his side. You have nothing." Thomas stared at the smug clerk, the walls of the courthouse seeming to close in on him. He was too late. Blackwood had beaten him to it. The law, the cold, impartial law, was on the side of the monster. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Now," Peterson said, his eyes gleaming, "Mr. Blackwood will petition the circuit judge for a writ of possession. The judge will grant it. And then the sheriff will ride out to your dilapidated ranch and retrieve Mr. Blackwood's property. If you resist, you'll be arrested. It's as simple as that." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "My advice to you, Garrett. Give the girl up. A man like Silas Blackwood, he's not someone you want for an enemy." Thomas stumbled out of the courthouse into the bright, indifferent sunlight, his mind reeling. He was trapped. There was no legal path, no way to fight this in a courtroom. He was going to lose her. He rode back to the ranch, a storm of fury and despair raging inside him. He had made a promise to that little girl. "Nobody's taking you anywhere." It was a promise he now had no idea how to keep. When he got back, Rose was waiting on the porch, the shotgun resting across her small lap. She looked like a tiny, fierce soldier guarding her fortress. She saw the look on his face, and her own expression crumbled. "He's here, isn't he?" she whispered. Thomas could only nod. He explained what the clerk had told him, about the bill of sale, the judge, the sheriff. He watched as the last, fragile embers of hope died in her eyes, leaving only the cold ash of resignation. She had been braced for this her whole life. For her, it was just the other shoe finally dropping. "So, I have to go with him," she said, her voice flat. "No," Thomas said, the word a raw tear in the fabric of the afternoon. He paced the porch like a caged animal. "No, I won't let that happen. There has to be another way." But what way was there? He couldn't fight the sheriff. He couldn't outrun the law forever. They were cornered. That evening, as they ate a silent, joyless meal, an idea began to form in Thomas's mind. A desperate, insane idea. It was born of rage and love and the absolute refusal to fail another child. If the law wouldn't protect her, he would have to go outside the law. He couldn't fight Silas Blackwood with lawyers and judges. But maybe he could fight him a different way. After Rose was asleep, Thomas retrieved the letter from the mining company. He read it again, his eyes scanning for any detail he might have missed. A letter was found among his personal effects, addressed to a Mr. Silas Blackwood of Willow Creek. Blackwood lived here, in this town. He went to his study and pulled out an old, dusty map of the county. Willow Creek wasn't a big place. A man like Blackwood, a man who bought children, would likely have a reputation. He spent all night planning. He was no longer a grieving farmer. He was a man with a mission. He would find out who Silas Blackwood was. He would find a weakness, and he would use it to destroy him. The next morning, he told Rose he had to go into town for supplies. He saw the fear in her eyes, the fear that he wouldn't come back. "I will always come back for you, Rose," he said, looking her directly in the eye. "Always." He rode into town, but he didn't go to the general store. He went to the one place where secrets were currency and reputations were made and broken. The saloon. He walked in, the smell of stale beer and sawdust hitting him like a wall. He was known here, but as the quiet man in the corner, nursing a whiskey and his own private ghosts. Today, he was different. He walked up to the barman, a big, gruff man named Henry. "I need information," Thomas said, his voice low and urgent, "about a man named Silas Blackwood." Henry stopped polishing a glass and eyed him warily. "Blackwood, why are you asking about him?" "He has something that belongs to me," Thomas said. "I aim to get it back." Henry let out a low whistle. "Son, you're either the bravest man in this county or the dumbest. Blackwood ain't a man you cross. He owns half the businesses in this town, holds the mortgage on the other half. He's got the judge and the sheriff in his pocket. He's untouchable." This was worse than he imagined. Blackwood wasn't just some slime ball. He was the king of this town. Thomas slid a silver dollar across the bar. Everyone has a weakness, Henry. Everyone has a secret. What's his? Henry looked at the coin, then back at Thomas. He leaned in close. He's got a big operation up in the hills. Logging camp. But folks say he does more than cut down trees up there. They say he's got a private mine. Uses cheap labor. People no one's gonna miss. Runaways, drifters, people who sign indenture contracts and are never seen again. The pieces clicked into place. Blackwood wasn't just buying one little girl. He was running a slave labor camp. Jeremiah Murphy hadn't sold Rose for $20 of pocket money. He'd sold her to feed the machine. "Where is this camp?" Thomas demanded. Henry shook his head. "You don't want to go up there. No one who goes up to Blackwood's Ridge ever comes back down." But Thomas knew he had to. If he could find proof of what Blackwood was doing, proof of a crime far worse than illegal indenture, he might have a chance. He could expose Blackwood, turn the tables, and save not just Rose, but all the others trapped up on that ridge. It was a suicide mission. But the thought of Rose's face, the image of her having to go with that monster, erased all fear. He left the saloon with a new, terrifying purpose. He rode not home, but towards the dark, looming hills that bordered his property, towards Blackwood's Ridge. As he rode, he saw a rider approaching from the direction of his ranch, a big man on a black horse. The man wore a fancy coat and a sneer that was visible from 50 yards away. As they drew level, the man pulled his horse to a stop, blocking Thomas's path. "You must be Garrett," the man said, his voice smooth and cold as a snake's belly. "I'm Silas Blackwood. I believe you have something of mine, a piece of property I recently acquired. I've come to collect her." The moment was here. The monster was real, and he was standing right in front of him. Thomas's hand went to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. This could end right here, on this road, one man against another. But Blackwood just chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Don't be a fool, Garrett. The sheriff and 3 of his deputies are right behind me. They have a warrant for the girl and another one for you if you cause any trouble. It's over." Thomas looked past him, and sure enough, cresting the hill were 4 more riders. The law, Blackwood's law. He was checkmated. He had run out of time. They were going to his ranch. They were going to take Rose, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Unless... He looked at Blackwood's smug face. Then he looked towards the dark woods of Blackwood's Ridge. He had one card left to play. A wild, desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. "You're right," Thomas said, forcing the words out, forcing a look of defeated resignation onto his face. He slowly took his hand off his rifle. "She's at the ranch. I'll take you there." Blackwood smiled, a predator's smile. A wise decision. Thomas turned his horse and began to lead the group of men back towards his home. But he wasn't leading them to the ranch. He was leading them on a slightly different path. A path that would take them right past the old abandoned quarry at the edge of his property. He had a plan. It was a terrible, dangerous plan, and it would either save Rose or get them all killed. As they rode, Thomas kept glancing at the men behind him. Blackwood, the sheriff, and his deputies. They were confident, relaxed, certain of their victory. They underestimated him. They saw him as a broken-down farmer, not a desperate man with nothing left to lose. They approached the turnoff for the main ranch house. Thomas didn't take it. Instead, he veered onto a narrower, overgrown trail that led up into the rocky hills. "Where are you going, Garrett?" the sheriff called out, his voice sharp with suspicion. "The ranch is that way." "Shortcut," Thomas called back over his shoulder, his heart hammering in his chest. "Quicker this way." He prayed they would buy it. He could feel their eyes on his back, could feel their suspicion growing with every step his horse took. The trail grew steeper, rockier. On one side was a sheer rock face, on the other a dizzying drop into the old quarry. This was the spot. This ain't no shortcut, Blackwood snarled from behind him. This is a trap. Thomas spun his horse around to face them. They were all clustered together on the narrowest part of the path. Below them, the quarry yawned open, 100-foot drop onto jagged rocks. It's over, Blackwood, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I know about your mine. I know about the slaves. Blackwood's face went pale, then contorted with rage. The sheriff and his men exchanged nervous glances. They knew. Of course they knew. They were on his payroll. You know nothing, Blackwood hissed. Kill him. But Thomas was prepared. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out not a rifle, but a stick of dynamite with a short, sputtering fuse. He'd taken it from his own stores, used for clearing stumps. He held it up, the flame dancing dangerously close to the tightly packed powder. This whole cliffside is rotten with shale, Thomas yelled over the wind. I light this, and we all go down together. You, me, and your paid-off lawmen. The men's eyes widened in terror. They were trapped. They couldn't go forward, and they couldn't retreat without trampling each other. You're bluffing, Blackwood spat, but there was sweat beading on his forehead. You'd kill yourself to save one worthless brat? She's not worthless, Thomas roared. She's my daughter. And yes, I would. He held Blackwood's gaze, letting him see the absolute certainty in his eyes. He wasn't bluffing. He had already lost everything once. He was not afraid to die. But Blackwood, a man who had built an empire on the suffering of others, was terrified of losing it all. The fuse burned shorter, spitting sparks. All right, the sheriff yelled, his voice cracking with fear. Don't do it! We'll back off! We'll leave! Not good enough, Thomas shouted. I want a confession, Blackwood. I want you to tell them what you've been doing up on that ridge. Tell them, or we all meet our maker right now. The fuse was inches from his hand. The smell of sulfur filled the air. Blackwood stared at the dynamite, then at the long drop, then at Thomas's unwavering eyes. The bravado drained out of him, replaced by pure, pathetic fear. It's a mine, he choked out, his voice a hoarse whisper. I use indentured workers. It's all legal. Liar, Thomas screamed. They're slaves. You work them to death and bury them where no one will find them. Say it. The fuse was almost gone. One more second. They're slaves, Blackwood shrieked, his composure shattering completely. They're slaves. Just don't light it, please. It was all Thomas needed. The sheriff and his deputies had heard it. A confession, made under duress, but a confession nonetheless. He threw the stick of dynamite, not at them, but over their heads, far out into the empty quarry. It arced through the air and exploded with a deafening boom against the far wall, sending a shower of rocks and debris into the chasm below. In the ringing silence that followed, Thomas pulled his rifle from its scabbard. He was no longer a farmer. He was a judge, jury, and executioner. But he didn't point it at Blackwood. He pointed it at the sheriff. You heard him, Thomas said, his voice cold as steel. You are sworn to uphold the law. Now, are you going to arrest this man for slavery, or are you going to die here with him? The sheriff, his face as white as a sheet, looked at Blackwood, then at the rifle pointed at his chest. The thin veneer of corruption cracked, revealing the coward underneath. He slowly drew his pistol and pointed it at his former employer. Silas Blackwood, the sheriff stammered, you're under arrest. The ride back to town was surreal. Thomas, with Blackwood and his corrupt lawmen as his prisoners, was no longer a wanted man. He was a hero. The confession, blurted out in terror on that cliffside, had been enough. Word spread like wildfire. By the time they reached Willow Creek, the townspeople were already gathering, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. The federal marshals were called in. They raided Blackwood's Ridge and found exactly what Thomas had suspected. A hidden mine, a dozen emaciated men and women living in squalor, and a graveyard of unmarked stones. Blackwood's empire crumbled in a single day. But Thomas didn't care about any of that. He only cared about one thing. He rode back to the ranch, his horse exhausted, his body aching, but his heart full. He found Rose exactly where he had left her, sitting on the porch, the shotgun still across her lap. She saw him coming, alone, and her face lit up with a brilliant, beautiful smile. She dropped the gun and ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs. He slid off his horse and knelt, pulling her into a fierce hug. "It's over, Rose," he whispered into her tangled hair. "It's all over. You're safe. You're home." A few weeks later, they stood before a new judge, a circuit judge sent by the territorial governor to clean up the corruption in Willow Creek. The adoption papers were stamped and signed without a second glance. As they walked out of the courthouse, hand in hand, Rose looked up at him. "So, am I Rose Garrett now?" she asked. "If you want to be," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She squeezed his hand. "I do." They walked back to the ranch, a father and a daughter, two broken souls who had found a way to make each other whole again. The ranch wasn't just a place of work anymore. It was a place of healing. They filled the empty rooms with laughter, and they filled the silence with stories. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors. Rose was holding a new carving she had just finished. It was a perfect, beautiful wooden horse. "I'm going to name him Thunder," she said softly, "for Michael." Thomas looked at her, at this incredible, resilient little girl who had walked out of a graveyard and into his heart, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that some flowers really do grow best in ground that has been broken. They had both been broken. But together, they had grown into something new, something better, something called a family. If you enjoyed this story, and you believe that everyone deserves a second chance at finding a family, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know when another story will come along that reminds us that even in the darkest of times, a little bit of kindness can change the world.